Well, hello again, Veritas. I think you and I are on the same page about the dispute and the nature of the dispute. At the very least, it seems apparent to me that we agree what the most interesting question you raised was. The evidence of divine beings or the lack thereof, and whether or not it can be a justification for positive disbelief. You'll have to forgive me at the outset, but this video is going to take something of a walk. Pardon me, but my mind does tend to wander. I think that the disparity in the responses you receive shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Very few people are raised in atheism as so many are raised in Christianity or Islam. So the fractured face we present when we all respond to the same question should be taken as an indication of the chaotic and circuitous routes many of us took to our various positions. It's also a reflection of various stages of development. The implications of a particular recognition may proceed in a particular order for all parties, but it in no way proceeds at the same rate. A year ago I might have considered myself a weak or a negative atheist, whatever the hell that means. And of course, we're talking about things apart from a belief in God, so while we may be atheists and have a similar position on God, we by no means embrace identical standards of evidence or place emphasis on the same criticisms of religion. Without God as a unifying agent, there's a lot of freedom for various positions on lots of things. I know atheists who are moral realists, though honestly, I don't know how they make it work. But again, we're talking about a lot more than where you stand on God. We're talking about worldviews, and this atheist's worldview and that atheist's worldview may not seem all that similar. Okay, now really to business. There is a gaping hole in this conversation as far as I can tell. Maybe one of your other responders covered it, but near as I can tell, we're missing an important piece of the puzzle. What God concept are we talking about? And that's not actually the puzzle piece I'm talking about. The hole is our failure to properly parse the relevant categories of God concepts. I mean, you've sort of given one, but in so doing, you bypassed an important part of the question. There are principally an infinite set of possible God concepts. As I suggested in my response to Telematros, we have God concepts that are grounded in the material world, like Prince Philip, a god to the indigenous peoples of the island of Tama. And then there are far less concrete God concepts, like the timeless, spaceless, immaterial, what have you. The classical interpretation of God the Father, who walked and talked with Noah, who flung Pharaoh's armies into the sea, who flooded the earth, who had eyes that saw and a mouth that spoke. I don't think there's any dispute with him, actually. I think the absence of evidence for many of the archaeological events said to have occurred in the Bible strongly suggests that, at the very least, a God with a personal history said to be partially divulged in the Bible doesn't exist. And other God concepts like this are obviously well addressed by the evidence aphorism. I mean, this is all fairly straightforward. If X, then Y. Not Y, therefore not X. And a little digression here, forgive me. I've been saying if X, then Y, but this isn't really accurate because in this particular argument, there is an unstated premise. It should read if A and B, then C, where A represents a God that leaves evidence, B represents the proposition that it's a sort of evidence we would expect to find, and C is the proposition that we would actually find it. The contrapositive of the conditional allows us to reasonably conclude, in principle, that God doesn't exist. Okay, end parentheses there. Now, let's face it, the overwhelming number of gods which have had any kind of following in this world have been gods which we would reasonably expect to have left behind some trace of themselves. It strikes me as wildly disingenuous to suggest the nebulous, inconceivable entities sophisticated theists like yourself support is the sort of God we atheists are typically rationally opposed to. If we're honest with ourselves, we have to recognize that the gods found in sophisticated Western theology are not the gods of any religion, but rather the gods of a sophisticated cult, namely the cult of sophisticated Western theology. I mean no insult in the term, at least no more than I mean when I use the word religion. I mean only that very few people practice a belief in a God of this kind. Now, in my opinion, these concepts are deliberately contrived to make room for God to remain, and it's much more profound than a God. It's much more profound than a God of the gaps, because many of these nebulous God concepts are defined such that it's no matter at all if all the gaps are closed. God can still exist, sort of below the floorboards of reality. I call these the immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and meaningless God concepts. At this point, a separate issue takes over, I think. It's no longer a question of evidence at all. Now the discussion moves into another mode. Can we meaningfully speak of such a God concept? Also, why would we want to? How do we reconcile the desire to speak of a God, which at this point is a word that is utterly without a referent, as a personal God? I mean, couldn't I insist that this pipe has a personality that's simply inconceivable to us? A personality that exists outside of time, space, and its material composition, and never manifests itself in a way we can perceive? Why is that absurd? I mean, in fact, the word pipe has the advantage of having a reference. I can point to this. And yet assigning it a personality and attributes, or non-attributes as the shoe fits, is ridiculous to most of us. Why does this card trick suddenly impress us? Why does it all make sense when we take away the pipe and simply speak of its disembodied personality, hovering out there beyond all space and time? Now, I think we're no longer talking exclusively about God at this point, as I said. I think we're talking about a whole new category of thing, and I don't think it's fair to continue couching this in terms of a dispute over the existence or non-existence of God. Now, conveniently, I have already invented a word for this kind of thing. I call them Winkums. I pair them with another invention of mine I call gibberflabs, and I will be covering them in another video, never you fear. A Winkum, though, is a member of the set of all things which are in all conceivable ways trivial. That is to say, the existence and the non-existence of a Winkum are two indistinguishable states of affairs. See how we're no longer talking about personal gods or impersonal gods, material or immaterial? Instead, we're talking about all kinds of things, even things we wouldn't want to call gods. It's fairly straightforward to see that this set is an infinite one. Now, the reason I want to generalize the focus of the conversation at this point is this. What if you win? I'll be honest. Let's say you're able to establish that this sort of trivial non-entity is the sort of thing a person can reasonably, positively believe in, perhaps on grounds of logical necessity, though honestly I doubt it. You still have your work ahead of you in establishing that one of them, the one that you call God, is a member of that important subset. And it goes much deeper than things which are contingently unobservable. For instance, subatomic particles would not properly be understood as Winkums in the Dark Age, because these things are not principally unobservable. No, a Winkum would be something like a ghost that you can't apprehend with any of your senses and is incapable of interacting with the material world entirely. If it existed and then ceased to exist, the difference would be, by definition, impossible to detect. Another fun digression here is if you ever insist that we should believe in a Winkum, it actually results in either an immediate contradiction or a glaring inconsistency. Because there are many Winkums, and that means there are many of them that are mutually exclusive. So you either believe in them all, producing an obvious contradiction, or you believe in only a few, chosen at random because, let's face it, you don't have any other calculus by which to determine which to believe. So by definition, if you are consistent and you believe in a Winkum, you are now believing in parrots in flight around Alpha Centauri, and wonderful plumage, the Norwegian blue. Yeah, that was a Monty Python reference. Enjoy it. Now, strictly speaking, I am an agnostic on Winkums. But agnosticism is an epistemic position, and that position is a clear reflection of indeterminacy of the question in the case of Winkums. But belief is not an epistemic position. And I live my life with the assumption that such things don't exist. And so do you. But one of us, and I'm not saying which, makes an arbitrary exception. At some point, we must all simply agree that the burden of proof is on the person making the positive claim. The practical implication of this is that disbelief is reasonable until reason is given to believe. A theist, fed up with my skepticism, once suggested that if I was told there was a hole in the floor and it was concealed by a rug, I would have to brazenly strut across it because I was just so damned faithless. It was a great example, I thought, but not for his side. You see, I would probably take caution and maybe even lift the carpet to see for myself. And despite my godless, nihilistic worldview, I would even be inclined to remove the rug so that the pit was obvious to others, like children and old ladies. But I understand the mechanism of gravity and the idea of a concealed pit, and my doubt would manifest itself in the form of an investigation. But at the end of that investigation, if no pit was found, or if the question is found to be insoluble, my behavior will reflect a positive disbelief. On the other hand, if he had told me that the rug was the favorite rug of the demons inhabiting the attic and that they would be offended if I walked on it, I might not be so receptive to the warning. So, I leave room for error, but I go through my life without the comfort of guardian angels or a promised afterlife. This is not mere absence of belief. It is positive disbelief. I live my life not as one who is simply unaware of or lacks a belief in a proposition, but as one to whom the question has been put, and one who answered, nope, that's bullshit. This is the Godless Heathen, signing off.